5 minutes each. He's very generous. Ed asked actually the best question for the entire evening, and I almost wish I'd have come up with it. He asked, what is the test for truth? And perhaps that cuts to the chase. For the Catholic, the test is not in any scientific study. It's not in any proclamation from an old person in the Vatican, but it's in a person whom we believe was fully human like us, but was also God. We call him Jesus of Nazareth. And in our tradition, we believe that God really did become one of us. He had fully a human will and fully was divine. And that is where our truth is anchored. Now, conceitedly, because he existed, historically speaking, 2,000 years ago, we don't have the immediate access to him that we wish. Every Catholic wished that Jesus would appear to us, just as if I could see you in the audience. But that's not the way God intended to reveal his truth. Rather, Jesus said, I'm going to send the Spirit. And incidentally, to our topic, as St. Augustine said, he didn't send, I'm going to send the Spirit to teach you about the sun and the moon. But he said, I'm going to send the Spirit to teach you about truth and what you should do. And yes, we do believe that he founded a group of people. They were imperfect. They were not that great at times. If you look at the 12 apostles, one of them betrayed him, a couple of them were afraid to acknowledge him, and the rest of them were too foolish to see what he was all about. But nevertheless, we do believe that is the church he established. Imperfect though it may be, with a bunch of idiots throughout our history, yes, but through it all, through the sinfulness, the truth of the Holy Spirit. See, we believe God, who we believe created all of reality, back to the first cause, had an idea, the word, the ultimate reason of reality, and that reality was reason. The Greeks called it logos. And that logos took the form of Jesus Christ. The Word was made flesh. And when Jesus went back to heaven, he sent the Spirit, and that's the truth. I'm getting a little more theological, but to answer your question, Ed, that is our test for truth. In that context, that's why we have obedience to our church. Now, the church has always said, yes, you need to follow the teachings of the church, but your conscience is ultimately supreme. But more to our overall topic, I submit, I'm pretty happy we're getting into deep theological. This is what we would be talking at St. Andrews anyway. Now we're talking about whether or not the Catholic Church makes sense. Now we're in the secondary question that Catholicism is more reasonable, but do we want to buy it? Do we want to have a God that allows suffering? Before we get to that, to answer the other question, does it make sense? Absolutely not. St. Augustine, who was more profound and brilliant than any Catholic, perhaps, and when he would preach, they would say, St. Augustine, you got it. We finally got it all figured out. God makes sense. And then he said, no, if it makes sense, it ain't God. God doesn't fully make sense. And to cut to your real challenge, why would a God allow such evil to happen? And again, I submit, if we're talking about that, we're in the secondary issue of whether we want to accept that God. We're not talking whether it's more reasonable that God exists. But conceding that calls into question whether it's even reasonable to believe in God, I don't have any simple answers. We cry out in anguish that those people suffered. But speaking of it from a philosophical point of view, what we're talking about is what we call physical suffering. If you look at it analytically, and I'm not trying to be insensitive, Lord knows our heart breaks. If you look at it, it was an earthquake. In the history of the world, earthquakes actually do good. So from just, assume there's no humans down there. Just think of it as the pure physiology of it. Earthquakes pretty much are necessary to keep the equilibrium. But the deeper question Ed asked is, then why didn't God intervene? None of us know. I certainly don't. But it doesn't mean God is not a loving God. I'm running out of time, but I think the best answer I've heard for this is that God is not a distant God that folds his hands and watches us suffer. God became man and took the form of Jesus and suffered more than any other human being. It's not a distant, cold God that lets us suffer and he lets us wiggle. No, God took on suffering head on. God embraced suffering. And
He transformed it. We don't understand it completely. But I guarantee you those seminarians that Ed said God didn't make sense, I guarantee you those seminarians got on their knees and said, we look, forgive me for pointing out the Catholic symbol, we look to the cross and we see how our founder, the ultimate grounding of truth, suffered, and we offer up this suffering to him. We don't understand it, but witnesses have told us there is a resurrection. St. Paul says if there's no resurrection, none of it flies. We have a resurrection. We have witnesses that said Jesus did rise from the dead, and that's where we get our faith. And back to our topic.
I can't explain suffering the way that you would like me to, but I do leave you with that thought, that it's not a distance God, it's a God that became one of us, that took on suffering head on. And we don't understand exactly how, but someday it's all going to be all right in the last judgment. Eyes have not seen, ears have not heard, but ultimately God's going to make it all right for those who follow and love him. And we believe that's fully consistent with our ability to reason.
Counselor, but I don't think you answered my question. I really don't. I understand that Charles and many of you have deeply held religious faith. I understand that he has repeatedly said things to convince us that he believes, and I'm not disputing that. I understand that he is sincere in his faith and in his beliefs, but it doesn't make sense. And I ask you, imagine to the best of your human ability, that's all we've got here is us human beings talking to each other. Imagine to the best of your human ability that an eternal creature with unlimited power was to go and hang on a cross for 2 or 3 days and suffer exquisite pain enough to make a Mel Gibson snuff flick for 2 or 3 days, and then compare that to a mother who finds out that the second child is also dead. I don't think there's any comparison. If, in fact, I were a God who had all kinds of unlimited powers and knew that this suffering was only going to be for a short period in all of eternity, I wouldn't think I would compare that. And offering up my suffering to the suffering of Jesus doesn't make any sense. I mean, we actually have been told, and I'm no expert on Mother Teresa, I haven't even read Christopher Hitchens' book on her, but I understand that she actually did say to people who were dying and suffering that this was a good thing, that they should offer their suffering to Jesus. And I'm sorry, but that's sadistic, that's not reasonable. That makes no sense. And I understand that one fellow said to her, when he was suffering a horrifying pain, and she said, well, Jesus must love you and is nudging you and paying attention to you now. He said, well, I wish he'd leave me alone. I think that you are confounding and building and creating a reality that just isn't there. A number of things that Charles said about atheism were incorrect. He insisted that we cannot believe in friendship or loyalty or trust or any of these other things without those being transcendent and in fact evidence of the natural theology, that the natural law and conscience. C.S. Lewis wrote about the same subject in a book called Mere Christianity. C.S. Lewis, of course, is not a Catholic leader, so maybe you have not read that book, but he makes the same argument that there must be a God because we all have this innate internal sense of right and wrong. But there's a big problem with that. The best explanation for the fact that all, except for the occasional psychopath or sociopath, that all of us do in fact have some sense of right and wrong is that we learn that from our culture. We learn that from our teachers and our parents and the ones that go before us as part of our society. And how do we know that that's the case? We know that by looking at other cultures where they do things that would that we couldn't imagine doing, where they, Aztecs, bring a virgin before the sun god and reach into her chest and pull out her heart while it is still beating. Now, we all agree that that's a horrible thing, but But the Aztecs didn't think so. That met with their test of conscience. That met with their sense of what natural law allows, because they were appeasing the sun god and getting him to come back. Human beings do not have a personal test for truth that is in any way consistent. I don't doubt at all that all of us have some sense of, again, excepting the sociopaths or whatever, have some sense of right and wrong. But the best evidence that it has evolved, that it is a cultural thing, very valuable thing, I'm not denigrating it, I'm not saying it's not a good thing to have, is that it varies so very much that what is moral or acceptable in one time or in one group or in one religion is quite different from what is moral or acceptable in another. You happen to be in a part of the country that not that long ago, a few generations back, preachers, I don't know whether it was including any Catholic priests, probably not, were preaching that slavery was an institution of God, that it was a valuable, positive institution of God, that it allowed these savages to be brought from Africa and have a chance to know Jesus. And by the way, the Catholic Church was not on record as opposing slavery until much after it was abolished. Now, slavery was abolished by a whole group of different people, including many, many Christians. I have no doubt that Catholics were a part of that. But the Catholics who abolished slavery were in direct disagreement and dispute with the Catholics who supported slavery, and the freethinkers and the Protestants and all the rest who supported slavery in this part of the world 140 years ago. Our morality is affected by the culture we live in. It is plainly and evidently so. Charles insisted that we atheists exalt science, worship science. I don't know any atheists who don't see science as making mistakes. It's done by human beings, and human beings certainly do make mistakes. It is a flawed system for getting at the truth, but it's better than anything else we've ever tried. And we have, in fact, made serious, we've had some terrible mistakes along the way from relying on science. I don't doubt that or deny it for a second. But we've had wonderful success overall in the last 300 years, that more progress in understanding how things work and why they work than in all the years of human history before that, because we have adopted a scientific approach, and we shouldn't be too simple-minded. It's not a simple little formula where you do this and then out pops the truth. It's a systematic approach where you weigh evidence. It does require evidence, but it also requires thinking and theories and testable hypotheses. And it's not simple at all. It's very complicated, but it is successful in improving our understanding. Charles insisted that we have to have, in order to be logical, a first cause, and that God is that first cause. But Charles didn't tell us what the first cause of God is. So apparently he also believes in a universe, in a reality that has something that isn't caused. God is not caused. Well, why don't you just accept the more obvious and straightforward truth that the universe is not caused? That it is a physical, it's not random. There are many, many physical processes. And Charles is going up against he doesn't know this, he's going up against a statistician when he starts rattling off these probabilities at 10 to the 40th and so forth. Big number of probabilities are very easy to come up with that are meaningless. If you just take the number of ways that the people on the front row could rearrange themselves, just these 15 or 20 people here, and just those chairs, and how many different ways they could rearrange themselves, there are more patterns that those people could get into on this front row than there are atoms in the universe. So improbability does not equal sense or explanation or meaningfulness. There are, just everywhere you look, there is improbable things. We only have one universe. The probability that we will have this universe is one, exactly one. I've heard cosmologists talk about the possibility of multiple universes. I don't know, maybe that's possible. It's definitely not something I can wrap my head around. And it isn't something that anybody knows anything about or understands anything about, even if it is true. We know that the choice is not between God and random. The choice